My favorite topic on energy issues. The one topic I've made very little progress on in the Congress, incidentally. It is very tough for people to face up to the fact that our energy future is grim. And it's a massive case of national denial and refusing to face the issue. We hope this session today will help get rid of that denial and that you can spread the word about what the facts are. Incidentally, the new daylight saving time, you can thank Congressman Fred Upton from Michigan for that. He managed to initiate that and get it through the House. I talked to him last week. He said the estimate is that this will save something like 100 million tons of coal in the course of a year across the U.S. That's amazing. I suggested we should go to daylight saving time year-round in that case. Our speaker today, who is going to give us some very good ideas about energy issues and how to deal with them, is an award-winning correspondent for The Economist. You all know what The Economist is. It's a wonderful magazine everyone quotes and loves to talk about but can't afford to subscribe to. But it is a great magazine. And my son, who has more money than I do, subscribes to it. He no longer trusts American journalism. Vijay Vaitheeswaran joined the magazine staff as a London-based Latin American correspondent in 1992. 2 years later, Vijay opened the first bureau of The Economist in Mexico City. And he remained there writing about political, financial, and cultural development in that part of the world until 1997, when he returned to the editorial headquarters in London. As the newspaper's global environment and energy correspondent, he covers the politics, economics, business, and technology involved in these topics. And that's quite a portfolio to carry around. It's certainly difficult, but I'm sure you're having a lot of fun doing it, Vijay. His portfolio now also encompasses pharmaceuticals, global health, biotechnology, and innovation. So he is one busy man. He is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. His commentaries appear regularly on NPR, Marketplace, Radio, Wall Street Journal, other media outlets. He's the author of a book on the future of energy, Power to the People, and I encourage you all to take a look at that. Harvard's John Holdren is a friend of mine, been active in energy issues for many years. Reviewing the book in Scientific American, called it by far the most helpful, entertaining, up-to-date, and accessible treatment of the energy, economy, environment problematique available. He also has written a new book called Zoom, The Race to Fuel the Car of the Future. I hope these writings will be very helpful in educating the American public about energy. And I've also, let me just add an editorial comment. Some of you may have heard this already in other speeches I've given in this area. But I think a basic problem, and looking at it as a physicist, to me energy is real because I've worked so much with energy. But for the average American, energy is intangible. And I think that is one of the biggest problems we have. You can't see it, hear it, feel it, touch it. And so people don't recognize what it is. And I've often commented that I wish energy were purple. Because if energy were purple and we could see it, when you go home from this and you would look at your house and see purple oozing through the walls and purple rivulets around the doors and the windows where the heat's leaking out. Or you're driving down the road and a Prius goes by, just a little purple around it, and then an SUV comes by with a big purple cloud. I mean, people would change their habits if they could see energy and see how it's being wasted and used. And failing that, we need experts like Vijay to come around throughout the world and tell everyone what energy is all about. I do have to apologize to Vijay and everyone here. I have to leave to catch a plane to Washington, so I'll be stepping out at 8:50. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to hearing you, Vijay. It's all yours.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you very much, Congressman, for that wonderful introduction. Too kind, in fact.
It's a great honor to be here. I am delighted to hear not only of today's morning event, and for me it's a delight as well as an honor, but to know that you have such business interest in supporting Aquinas and having a day of conferences and really thinking about what might be the role of business and markets in solving some of the energy problems. Because in a sense, I share the Congressman's view if we were more aware of energy, as he says, if it were purple, ordinary people might be doing more about it. I can't promise that we can turn it purple, sir, but we might be able to turn it green, as in the color of money. Because once we were able to think about markets, about the value of energy in terms of our own money coming out of our pockets, or in terms of business opportunities, that might be the sort of green that many more Americans would pay attention to. And in some ways, where that's the underlying theme of my talk to you today. I want to take up the question of whether the energy business is going to continue on a business-as-usual trajectory, or whether, in fact, it might be ripe for revolution. And I use that word carefully because revolution comes very rarely, and it's especially to an industry like energy, whose assets are very long-lived, right? Petrochemical plants, coal plants last 50 years. We have, unlike cell phones, let's say, where people swap them out every 6 months or a year. So capital stock turnover, the question of stranded assets, and the fact that, in fact, gasoline works really, really well. If you leave aside some of the environmental and geopolitical concerns, the old hands in the business, and I'm an old engineer from MIT myself, so I know this firsthand. The best substitute for gasoline, is what we like to say among engineers. And so it's actually quite good at what it does, which is moving your car. And so it's quite difficult to imagine how do we get from here to there unless we begin to think a lot more creatively. And in particular, there are three forces that I want to put to you that are taking place around the world that are making the current energy system unsustainable. And I would argue to you this is what lays the foundations for the revolution that I think will happen in energy that's beginning to unfold. And these are three interlinked forces, but they're not always apparent as we go about our daily lives. But in the course of a decade covering the topic for The Economist, traveling around the world at firsthand talking to leaders of the energy industry, but also people that use energy in various ways, utilities, ordinary consumers, regulators around the world, I've become convinced these three forces are very, very powerful forces for change. One of these, of course, is the link between energy and geopolitics. Now, this is what grabs the headlines, we all know. We've seen questions of oil prices that fell to $10 a barrel in 1999, going up to almost a high of $80 recently. We know there's open attacks on the Saudi oil infrastructure by Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden has explicitly said he's targeting the oil infrastructure because he wants the oil price. In his view, he thinks $144 a barrel is the fair price, and that the West is stealing America's stealing Saudi oil. So we have a geopolitical problem. And the problem arises, of course, because oil is incredibly concentrated. 2/3 of the world's remaining oil reserves are in the hands of just 5 countries. Saudi Arabia, which has almost 1/4 of the world's conventional oil reserves, and each of its 4 neighbors, who have about 10% each. And this is a particularly unstable, certainly undemocratic part of the world, and maybe an unreliable supplier of oil in the future. And here's the problem. That's bad enough in terms of geopolitics, but oil in places outside of that part of the world, the North Sea, for example, or the Gulf of Mexico, or other non-OPEC areas, is beginning to run out. Don't believe it when you see the headlines saying the world's running out of oil, or we're hitting Hubbert's peak. We can talk about it in Q&A if you like, but that's not true, and that's demonstrably not true. But what is true is the easy oil, the cheap oil, and the oil that's not in the hands of countries like the OPEC countries or Russia, that is running out. And that's very bad news for consumers, because what it does is enhances the market power of the OPEC producers. And every official estimate, including the Department of Energy, says 10 years and especially 20 years out, the Saudi Arabian share of the world oil market is going to be dramatically larger, perhaps as much as double what it is today. And if you're concerned about America's energy security, You don't have to be an environmentalist. If you're simply concerned about our national security, that is as good a reason as any to be concerned about energy and to say, we need to find alternatives. So that's one pillar of unsustainability, I would argue. And this is only exacerbated by the rise of China and India, and behind it, South Africa, Brazil, the developing world giants. We've seen how in the last few years, China's come on the world stage. Its economy, we know, is growing at a tremendous rate. Its energy consumption is growing even faster. And we've seen China grow tremendously insecure and gobbling up oil and gas assets in Kazakhstan, in the Sudan, where they're playing a role in keeping the world from doing something about the Darfur genocide. Because China has oil assets and interests in Sudan. They're using the Security Council veto to prevent any kind of global action in that country, that awful tragedy happening there. We see China in Venezuela looking around with the Canadian tar sands, the energy resource that they have in Alberta. And this has created, of course, a lot of headlines. Now, why are they doing this? For all of its history, until about 10 years ago, China used to be energy independent. But because they have a decent amount of oil in China itself. But as their economy has grown in leaps and bounds, and especially as Chinese have begun to take to cars, and they built out suburbs like America, really, what happened? Their oil consumption went through the roof. In 2004, China's oil consumption went up 16%. I mean, that's an extraordinary rise. That was a big factor behind why global oil prices went through the roof over the last few years. What do the Chinese know? They know that they have to get their oil mostly from the Middle East. They also know that they don't have a blue water navy. They don't have the capability to defend oil imports coming in from the Middle East. If there were, and this is how their national security thinkers think, this is perhaps their top concern going forward. If there were to be any kind of confrontation with the United States over the next 20 years, let's say over Taiwan or some other issue like that, they know when push comes to shove, the United States can cut off its supplies of oil. They're tremendously insecure about this. That's part of the reason why they're going around the world overpaying for oil and gas assets, trying to strike deals with Russia on pipelines. This is a source of tremendous insecurity for China because it's not able to protect its energy resources. And so I foresee a possibility. I'm not predicting this because I think ultimately I think China and America can get along because we're both consuming nations. It's in our interest to see peace and stability in the Middle East, for example. It's in both our countries' interests to develop alternatives to energy. But that's not necessarily how politicians or geostrategists think. They tend to be insecure. And if you look at the way China has behaved, it has been quite reflexive in how it's behaved overseas. It's possible in the Middle East you'll find China entering into conflict with the U.S. as it seeks to lock up oil and gas assets. And bear in mind, they have three advantages that the United States doesn't have. We may have the most powerful military in the world, but the Chinese have three advantages when they go and talk about trying to secure oil and gas assets. The first is, you're never going to find the Chinese lecturing anyone about human rights and democracy. And that goes over pretty well in the Middle East. The second thing, the Chinese, let's say they're a little more relaxed about sharing sensitive missile technology with countries like Iran that the U.S. would consider rogue states. That's a problem. And the third problem, of course, is that the Chinese have no great love for Israel. And that puts them in a better position to deal with Arab states than the U.S., which does have a concern about Middle East policy. And so for these reasons, I think we're going to find the Chinese maneuvering very carefully in the Middle East in ways outmaneuvering the U.S. That may lead to some geopolitical flashpoints. That's not to predict a war, but that's just to point out the relationship between energy and geopolitics points to one of the reasons why this is an unsustainable energy system. A second reason actually arises from the fact that the system has utterly failed over a quarter of humanity. Somewhere between 1.6 and 2 billion people on Earth, almost a third of humanity really, has no access to modern energy. These people have never flicked a light switch, and they never will. They have no modern electricity. They have no modern fuels, clean fuels like we know. They have the grid electricity or the transport systems that we take for granted have completely failed these people. Again, it's not a marginalized few. We're talking almost 2 billion people. And this is, it tends to be in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. And in these countries, it's usually women and girls who walk for miles a day to fetch twigs, stone, whatever they can get, crop residue. Sometimes it's just cow dung, believe it or not, which they burn in very sort of inefficient makeshift cook stoves that release so much indoor pollution that it's, and often with their small children in the huts, this leads to what the WHO, the World Health Organization, says is one of the leading preventable causes of death in the world, on par with malnutrition. But when was the last time you heard a Live Aid concert to stamp out the cow dung fires in India? Hey, even Bono doesn't care. It's not a sexy issue. But if we actually think about the human condition, if you think about actually what's a sustainable energy system, leaving out almost a third of humanity surely is not an acceptable proposition. And in fact, even if you were to take the sort of callous view, say, hey, what's that got to do with me? I didn't create that problem. I'm going about my life here in the United States. Well, what we're finding is the developing countries, of course, the ones like China that are getting richer, the ones like Brazil that are innovating with ethanol and other kinds of fuels, they're coming and knocking on our door. That there's enough wealth now in the developing parts of the world that they're making their presence known through globalization, a flatter world. And what you're finding is that through China's impact, for example, on world oil markets, or, as we saw with President Bush's visit this week to Brazil, the potential for Brazil's impact on ethanol markets, new technologies, new ways of thinking, and on the negative side, with the potential for environmental harm, that if China, for example, and India and South Africa, 3 countries that have almost infinite quantities of coal that they're burning, their potential impact on global warming. You may say, look, what's that got to do with me? Well, if China's putting up 1 coal plant a week, giant coal plant a week, Chinese are taking to cars in rates not seen in any other country in human history. The world is soon going to be a world of 1 billion cars, which is extraordinary when you think about the potential for greenhouse gases coming from that. Well, that's going to affect the rest of the world. It would make the flawed UN Kyoto Treaty irrelevant, the new greenhouse gases that are to come from the developing world, if we think about business as usual. And that's why I say the environmental aspect of this, the link between energy and environment, is the third great pillar of unsustainability, why we can't continue on business as usual. Whether you believe in the security aspects and those appeal to you more, whether you talk about the market aspects and the potential for economic shocks due to oil and the al-Qaeda terrorism angle, whether you think about, again, the environmental aspects. There are multiple pillars of instability that the current system isn't working, and it's headed for something of a car crash. And I just wanted to share a small anecdote with you, if I may, about someone who disagrees with me. In the interests of full disclosure, I don't want to paint a view of only rose-tinted glasses and change. I had the opportunity to talk to someone who fundamentally disagrees with this analysis. The chairman of ExxonMobil, who just recently retired, Lee Raymond, who ran Exxon for many years, arguably the most successful oil man in history since the days of J.D. Rockefeller himself. Certainly when you measure on financial returns, on efficiency, on Exxon is by far the best performing oil company on most of those conventional metrics. He himself was a legendary oil boss. And he fundamentally disagreed with the argument I'm putting to you about the energy system. So I thought I'd briefly give you the counterpoint, and I'm happy to talk about it further at the Q&A. Lee Raymond never liked journalists. I don't think it's a big secret. But I did manage to get some time on his calendar a few years back for a visit to Irving, Texas, the headquarters of his $300 billion empire, as it was back then. It's even bigger now with the oil price rise. And so I went to Exxon headquarters. Before I could sit down in the chair in his very spacious executive suite, I knew I was in trouble because he had a scowl on his face, and he was holding a copy of The Economist with a cover story I had just written the previous week, and he didn't look very happy at all. The cover said, "What to do about global warming." And I knew this was going to be trouble because that cover had already gotten me into trouble. The previous week, when I had written this article, well, I'll give you the backstory here. This is going back again probably to 2000, 2001. This was a crucial moment when the UN's Kyoto Treaty ultimately fell apart. This was a turning point in UN climate negotiations. And I had taken on the energy job some time ago before that, and I spent a long time reviewing the best science. The economist's position on global warming was, well, it seems to be something here, but it's not certain. Let's wait and see. There might be costs of action. As the world economy gets richer, we'll have better technologies. We might be better positioned to do something. So it was a bit of an armchair skepticism that we expressed in the mid-'90s. And I went and looked hard at the science. I talked to the world's leading scientists, including many of the world's skeptical scientists, a good number of whom were back at my old alma mater at MIT, quite skeptical on the science. And I wrote a lengthy piece explaining, here's what we know, and in particular, here's what we don't know. And beyond that, here's what we will not know for the next 4 decades. And there are uncertainties in this kind of problem. The science will be uncertain in a number of ways. But that doesn't mean we don't know anything. And I tried to explain there's more than enough evidence now, particularly of a few things, that this is a real problem. There's a human fingerprint, although that's not the only contributor to the problem. And there's potentially catastrophic consequences if we cross irreversible triggers. That is, this is not a problem like most environmental problems, where the clean air, the clean water. I mean, let's remember, LA was filthy in terms of smog for most of the 20th century. The great London fog, it was very charming to think about London fog. We think of Big Ben, maybe those raincoats that some people used to wear in the 50s and 60s. Well, it wasn't that charming. It was coal pollution that combined with the atmospherics of London. In 1952 or 1951, there was an episode of London fog that killed 10,000 people prematurely. That's how filthy the air was in London. And we remember the novels of Dickens, London was a filthy place. But as it got richer, it got greener. And that's the history of the world when it comes to local pollution. Most local problems are reversible. But that's not the case necessarily with a problem like climate change. There are irreversible trigger points that if we cross, it may make life uninhabitable for Earth uninhabitable for humans. The Earth will go on, but it may not be suited to our lifestyles, to our cities, our lakes, the way we live along the coast. And so my argument was, just as you would think about a potential for a catastrophic fire at your house, it's worth getting some fire insurance. And maybe even putting up some sprinklers, put away the matches. Even if your house never burns down, is it a waste of time to buy fire insurance? Most people would probably say not, especially if you live in an area that might be prone to fires. They would say take some prudent steps, both actions in terms of minimizing the risk, like I say, put away the matches, clear some brush around your house, but also in terms of buying the fire insurance. And that's what I argued, having gone through the best science, explaining the evidence why it's worth taking seriously despite the uncertainties. I said, take some prudent steps, some insurance. And I explained in an editorial that went with that what such a sensible policy would look like. I said the Kyoto policy is flawed. Came out quite aggressively, explaining why the targets and timetables that were negotiated by Al Gore and his European counterparts were politicized. They were not based on the science. They were based on backroom negotiations. They were unrealistic. They were not they could not have been accomplished by any president. It wasn't just President Bush. Anyone who had taken over in 2000 would have found them impossible to meet, the American targets particularly. They were not based on good science. I argued the targets and timetables should be revisited, changed. But basically, though, I did argue that that approach, the Kyoto approach, had a couple of things to redeem it. And this is where I got into trouble with Lee Raymond. My argument was, this is the most global of all problems that we're going to face. I mean, we're asking our leaders, our political leaders, to think about and be concerned with and take actions on behalf of voters who aren't even born yet, right? That's the nature of the problem. It's a 100-year problem. That's how long greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide stay up in the atmosphere, 100 years. And it's a very difficult question to ask political leaders to think about voters who haven't even been born yet, or who may be living in a country on the other side of the world with no influence on your political process. So it takes a different kind of leadership, but mostly it takes a global approach. And actually, the UN and the Kyoto policy is a global approach. It involves every country in the world, and over time, every country in the world will participate in this. So that's the right framework. The second thing that recommended it was it had a process for learning over time. And that is, it's not just a one-shot treaty as it's been often portrayed. There's actually an underlying UN treaty that George Bush's father signed when he was in office that actually envisions a long-term process for scientists and for the political leaders to get together every so often, revisit the latest science, and either ratchet up or ratchet down, depending on what the best science says. And this is actually the right way to think about this, because we have a lot of uncertainties. The science will get better as we go along, and we'll know. Maybe we don't need to have so much insurance, or maybe we need to, put up even more sprinklers, or maybe put up our house on stilts or something, right? We don't know. But it's important to have a process that's smart and that learns. And that's exactly what Kyoto does envision. The analogy is something like the free trade process. It was just a glint in the eye of free traders, including my editors and predecessors who've been arguing for 160 years why free trade is a good thing at The Economist. We were founded to fight the Corn Laws in Britain, protectionist laws, and argue the case for free trade when it was very unpopular. And just like that, the folks who argued for the GATT round of trade negotiations, ultimately leading to the WTO and global free trade, well, it took them decade after decade of meeting, often in despair and failure and frustration, or very small concessions were won. But that's how we got progress. And similarly, the arms limitations talks with the Soviet Union. Year after year, decade after decade, patience. And over time, we ultimately kept the Cold War in check. It didn't get out of control. And so I would urge all of us to think about the process of climate as a long-term process where we need to come back and eventually, as countries move closer together in alignment in terms of interests, as climate focuses one's mind on the best science, the evidence from how the climate system actually changes focuses our mind as whether it's storms or whether it's other kinds of changes in weather patterns, body politics, like in America and other countries, will encourage politicians to say, let's get serious about this. How do we do this? How do we see opportunity in doing this for our own companies, our forward-looking companies that can perhaps benefit from investing in clean energy technologies or sustainability? So that's the argument I put forward. Kyoto is flawed, so fix it. Don't scrap it altogether. Well, you might think that was a balanced argument, but I was pounded by European environmental groups. I'd never received a mailbag quite as big as I did that week from Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, UK, and so on. Why? Because I dared to criticize their sacred cow, the Kyoto Treaty, pointing out its flaws, explaining why the targets which they cherish were unrealistic and not going to be accomplished by any president of the United States, never mind being approved by any Congress. I got on the plane and went to Irving, Texas, and I was pounded from the other side of the spectrum by Lee Raymond. He went through, with breathtaking ferocity, through my article, berating me for reliance on faulty science, for ignorance about the statistics, and ultimately, and not really having much of a clue about climate dynamics, and just about everything, including being an all-around boob. Now, I took careful notes, B-O-O-B. But when he finished, of course, I gave him my rebuttals. I explained what were the sources that I used, what was the ice core data for temperatures, or what was the peer-reviewed scientific literature that I'd drawn all of my science from, including from the leading organizations in the world that, for example, the National Academy of Sciences, the top scientific body in the United States, Britain's Met Office, their equivalent office, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Nature, Science, the leading scientific journals in the world, peer-reviewed literature, the state of the science on this was all I reported. No hearsay, no anecdotes. And his response was, those are government scientists. You can't believe what they say. They have a vested interest in perpetuating this myth about global warming. Now, perhaps I crossed the line of journalistic neutrality, for which I apologize. I couldn't help but respond, what should I do, Mr. Raymond? Only rely on the climate science funded by oil companies like yours. You should have seen the look on the other Exxon officials' faces. I don't think talking back to Lee Raymond was a company policy. In fact, I found out it wasn't because he gave me one other interview just a couple of years ago before his retirement. Halfway through that interview, he chucked me out of his office, in fact. And as soon as I walked in for that second interview, the first thing he said was, you should know that everyone at Exxon works for the general good, and I'm the general of the general good. You can quote me on that. And so I did. I did a full-page profile, the general of the general good, that ran in The Economist a couple of years ago. But back on that occasion where we had the tussle on climate science, and I gave him my cheeky retort, I have to actually say, Lee Raymond came back and surprised me. He said, you know what, Vijay, you're right. If we take out the government money and we take out the oil company money, there isn't any climate science left at all. So we both laughed and we agreed to disagree about climate science. And we went on to have a very productive discussion about the future of energy, where he made it very clear that he believes not only is the current energy system, fossil fuel-based energy system, sustainable, but essential for America's well-being. In his argument, access to very economical hydrocarbons, particularly gasoline, is the basis of America's competitive advantage in the world. He feels it's, in fact, I mean, he accused me quite directly of being a Euro-socialist loony, to use a direct quote, for proposing the idea that we might need to do something about the geopolitical, the environmental, and the potential economic shock implications of our current reliance of the current energy system that we have. When I pointed out to him that, you know, President Bush, Tony Blair have talked about moving to a lower carbon economy, his answer, they don't know what they're talking about. I said, okay, well, they are politicians. You know, maybe they say things they don't really understand. What about the chairman of BP or the chairman of Shell? Both those companies had set up renewable energy divisions, hydrogen fuels. They were setting up and spending, you know, on the order of $1 billion a year each. Show me the money, was what he said. And his point, and I take his point very carefully, very, very seriously, you know, they might be spending $1 billion a year on renewable energy, and probably all those ads they spend saying they're beyond petroleum cost as much as well. But these companies are spending $15 billion a year on oil and gas exploration and production each. Just to repeat that, $15 billion each in upstream oil and gas, that is, being oil companies. They're spending on the order of maybe $1 billion on renewables, windmills, solar, all the other stuff put together, hydrogen, etc. And for the next 20 years, BP is going to be burning petroleum, not beyond petroleum. And so I take Lee Raymond's point very seriously. Look beyond the rhetoric. Let's actually look at where companies are making investments. What is the size of the marketplace? And so there is a lot of sense in going beyond just the propaganda and some of the corporate social responsibility talk. Let's look a little harder. And ultimately, the lesson I take away from my conversation with him is that it's too much to ask to expect oil companies to lead the world into clean energy. Now, the social contract says there's nothing evil about oil companies selling oil, just as there's nothing wrong with car companies selling cars, even if they're big SUVs. At least that's my view. I think that if society's expectations change, then we need to make that plain, but society needs to change the rules, the regulations, and ultimately consumer choices in the marketplace. But expecting oil companies to lead the world into a low-carbon economy, as you know, Lord Brown at BP has said publicly, when I grill him privately, he himself was the one who confessed that, in fact, you know, for the next 20 years, we're going to be selling oil as our oil and gas as our dominant fuel, and actually gave a little bit of a mea culpa. He said, when we talked about, we made a mistake in overselling ourselves. We confused our aspirations for society with what we could deliver ourselves as an oil company. And that's a lesson he himself takes as he goes into retirement, that he thinks he made a mistake. He was giving advice through me to Jeff Immelt, the chairman of GE, who's now turned GE into a green company, or so the ads would claim. But anyone who looks at GE's profile of investments knows the eco-imagination stuff is only a part of what they do. Much bigger part is what GE's always done, which has not very much to do with the environment at all. And so look beyond the aspirations and look at where companies actually put their money. You'll get a little closer sense of where business stands. That's Lee Raymond's point, and I take that as a real dose of reality. Now, that doesn't persuade me on his view that global warming is a hoax, but I did want to share that with you because I do think it's an important counterpoint, as business people particularly, in thinking about this. What is the role of business? What's the role of individuals? And what is the role of the marketplace? But ultimately, what's the role of government policy? Because, you know, I come from a free market magazine, as you will know, but I do believe there's an important role for government policy. Particularly, I believe, as I was mentioned, I think if you're changing the social contract on something like the energy industry, like the coal business, you know, it's been perfectly legal and accepted and encouraged to put up coal plants, and coal miners courageously and quite dangerously dig up coal, and coal companies that keep the economy going. More than half our electricity comes from coal. If we're going to expect something else, then it has to be through government. There has to be some compensation, I would argue, for the stranded assets that people have made investments in. You can't change the rules of the game midstream without anticipating people like Exxon to push back, to denounce the science, because you're changing the rules midstream. And so that's one important lesson. But does this mean this is a case for pessimism? I wanted to give you, on the contrary, actually, my book is quite optimistic. I really believe that change is coming, and is coming really faster than it has any time in 100 years. If you look at the energy world 100 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, we saw the era of Henry Ford, Thomas Edison. This was an extraordinary era of innovation, exploration, of transformation that led to the 20th century's miracle economic progress because of cars, electricity, the fundamental transformation of the energy system. We are entering a period with similar kind of innovation, uncertainty, but ultimately the potential for something better because of three megatrends. And I'll just mention them briefly, and I want to turn to question and answers. We can perhaps discuss them further, because I'm mindful that you don't want me droning on and on forever. But I did want to explain to you why I'm optimistic. The first of these three reasons that sort of arise from the unsustainability of the energy system, and change, I think, is coming fast. The first is the liberalization of energy markets. For most of the 20th century, energy markets have not been competitive. Electricity, particularly, which is at the bedrock of the American economy, well, we've had a mentality in terms of how we regulate electricity that's the opposite of competition. We don't reward innovation. We want to, steady as she goes, just keep the lights on. Well, we've seen a dramatic change in the last 20 years in how we look at regulation of energy markets, moving towards competition, encouraging liberalization, not just America. I mean, Britain led the way under Margaret Thatcher. We saw this in New Zealand. We see this in countries around the world. Scandinavia was another pioneer. Even though one might think of Scandinavia as a socialist place, they were among the world leaders in liberalizing their electricity markets with great success. Why do I say this is such a great thing? Well, you might say, well, you're a dogmatist from a free market magazine. You're going to say competition is better than the alternative. Well, that's true. I do think that competition and competitive markets are better than the alternative over the long haul. I think it leads to more efficient outcomes. But that's not why I'm presenting the argument here to you today. It's a different reason. And it has to do with the nature of energy, what's wrong with the energy system today. When you're moving towards competitive markets, liberalization of energy markets is the essential enabler of innovation in what is one of the least innovative industries on Earth. Historically, despite the vast amount of capital that the energy industry has, it's actually lacking in fundamental innovation. I'll give you one small statistic to back that up, because I made a big boast or a big claim. One small statistic. If you look at the U.S. electricity industry, it's a vast enterprise. In terms of revenues, it's bigger than the cell phone business and the long-distance telephone business combined. In terms of assets, it's even more. Of course, it's an asset-intensive business. If you look at how much of those revenues the electricity industry reinvests into research and development, which is a fundamental measure of innovation, 0.5% of revenues are reinvested into R&D. And that figure has been true for the last 3 decades. And I'm not making that up. It's not an outside consultant number. That's from the Electric Power Research Institute. That's the industry's own figure. Now, I'm not pointing fingers. I mean, the reason that's so low is because that's how we regulated the industry, on a rate of return basis. They weren't rewarded for innovation. On the contrary, public utilities commissions would look at them very suspiciously if they were to try to do something out of the ordinary, innovate in some new ways. Now, that's changing, and I know here you have a great example in Michigan of DTE, which is actually thinking quite out of the box in terms of the future of utilities. But that's also a creature of the liberalization that we've seen in electricity markets, I would argue, and gas markets. And so fundamentally, as an enabler of innovation, of new kinds of energy services, of smarter, more sustainable ways of giving consumers the one thing they want. Consumers don't want electrons. They don't care. They want cold beer and hot showers, right? What's called energy services. And if we can find smarter, more competitive ways to do that, bringing in the technology revolution that's happened in the internet world, the telecoms world, really in just about every other aspect of biotech, innovation, everything else in the U.S. economy has moved to the 21st century. why is energy and the related industry of transport stuck in a 1950s mentality? Well, a big part of it has to do with the fact it hasn't been liberalized properly, and now we're getting there. The second and related point is a fundamentally different kind of environmentalism. For a long time, U.S. environmentalism and its sisters around the world were trapped in a mode of what I would call top-down, command and control environmentalism, where business was the enemy, and the guys at NRDC, one of the big environmental outfits, one of the founders of NRDC told me, who's now the dean of Yale School of Environment, in the old days, our attitude was, mandate, regulate, litigate. That's the way we look at business. That's how NRDC was founded. Well, fundamentally, again, another mea culpa from one of the old grand men of environment, he told me, we got it wrong. We didn't understand markets. We didn't understand market-based environmentalism, the role of externalities, of pollution taxes, of trading. And sure enough, when George Bush, the father, introduced an extraordinarily innovative approach to solving the acid rain problem. You all remember how controversial acid rain was 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Nobody was talking about global warming then. Acid rain was the big environmental problem that America was concerned about 15, 20 years ago. Well, George Bush solved that problem, the father, with the amendment to the Clean Air Act, with an innovative approach that's called SO2 trading. You'll know about this, acid rain trading, that has basically solved the problem for America and for the world at much lower cost than previously expected, much faster than anyone forecast. But almost every single environmental group was opposed to it. The noble one exception was the Environmental Defense Fund, which has always understood economics and argued for market-based solutions. They're the one that stood with Bush at the podium at the White House and said, this is a good idea, and they were vilified by the rest of the environmental community. Well, today I'm happy to report that even the European environmental groups understand markets. In fact, Europe is now pioneering a number of market-based instruments, innovative ways to apply market-friendly pollution taxes that don't distort and pick technologies. They don't tell you what scrubber to pick. They tell you what outcome there is. You figure out how to get there. And so there's a real revolution in environmental thinking that sees markets particularly as an ally and business as part of the solution rather than the problem. That's a fundamental transformation. I'm seeing it in New Delhi. I'm seeing it in Brasilia. I'm seeing it in Shanghai. So I think this is really changing the nature of the game and fundamentally argues for why this revolution will speed up. The third point, and I've already alluded to this, is the technological innovation. We are in a golden era of energy technologies. I talk to a lot of venture capitalists, private equity guys, and the amount of interest from Wall Street as well as the traditional sources of financial capital that have been the engine of innovation for the U.S. to really become the 21st century economy that it's been, they've historically stayed away from energy. It's been too difficult for them to penetrate. Well, that's changed, especially in the last 5 years. And so I think you're finding a flurry of, and it's just beginning, the wave of technologies, the innovation. I mean, I want the two guys in the garage who created Hewlett-Packard and changed Silicon Valley and made it the engine of the digital economy. I want them to be working on energy. And I want them to know they're going to get rewards in the marketplace. And of course, the only way this will happen, these three trends come together, is fundamentally, I don't think, simply asking for business to do charitable good works, to invest in this on a wing and a prayer, just do the right thing because it's, you want to sleep well at night. I don't think that's going to work. I do think, fundamentally, we do need change in legislation. And there's a number of things in Congress, and in particular, the right way to do it. There are a lot of bad, awful regulations, bad ways to do it. The right way to do it is for government to pick the outcome, but don't distort the marketplace by picking technologies. Don't tell us how to get there. And the problem with energy is what the economist nerds would call externalities, right? When you burn energy, particularly fossil fuels, it has environmental implications, implications for human health, and geopolitical complications that are not included in the price. And there's very good solutions to this that has to do with market-based approach to pollution taxes. And I think that's ultimately where the country needs to go. We're looking at cap-and-trade systems in Washington. Everyone, you'll follow the news. You'll know this perhaps affects your own business. That's a proxy. That's another way of doing it. As long as it's a trading system and it's market-based, doesn't predict outcomes, doesn't pick on one sector only and not the others, doesn't distort outcomes, whatever way we do it, I think we need to start. We need to set a framework. It should be long-term. It should be non-distortionary, and we should let the innovators, the marketplace, not government bureaucrats, pick the solutions, because that's what we do best in America. I mean, at the moment, we happen to be at the heart of the global energy problem, but we're also going to solve the problem for the world when we start to get serious about it, just as we have really over the last 50 years on almost every serious problem. We are the most innovative economy on Earth, and as we get serious on energy, we will solve this problem for the world. Thank you. Now, I'm delighted to take your questions. If I haven't stunned you all into silence or bored you into sleep, I would love some, hopefully, provocative questions on issues that you disagree with me on. I see a gentleman in the front row here.
Thank you. Enjoyed your speech very much. Could you go over the business model of Toyota and their commitment to hybrid cars and how it appears to be that they'll be taking over General Motors as the #1 car?
Sure. I promised everyone I didn't set up that question, but my next book, which comes out this autumn, on the future of the car, actually has quite a lot to do with Toyota and the company's learning culture, how it became #1, what it means for the rest of the global economy. Toyota is an interesting case. It is simply one of the best companies on Earth, regardless of the comparison with Detroit or anything else. It's better than the other Japanese companies. They have gotten something right in the way that GE has gotten something right. For being such a huge company, it's very difficult, as you all will know. The bigger you get, it's very difficult to continue growing, continue to be nimble, continue to innovate. And Toyota has a learning culture that has evolved organically, and where they've learned. They've sought out the best in class. They keep moving the bar on individual managers, on where the company's at. And they have a long-term vision. I'm giving some of the threads as to what has made Toyota successful. They have continually looked at beyond the next quarter, beyond the next year, tried to identify longer-term trends where they can meet the future aspirations of consumers, future needs, as well as the likely direction of government policy drawing on. And in this case, they rightly identified that fuel economy and related issues would be an issue. That's part of the reason why they developed the Toyota Prius. Now, the Prius is only one leg of their strategy, of course. The reason Toyota is global #1 is because they are a very, very, very good manufacturing company. And they don't overpromise. The cars you buy do what they tell you that they're going to do. They have good quality standards. There's a number of reasons. They have the right price points. But if you ask specifically about, as it relates to our energy environment question, what I would say is this. The way I look at the Toyota Prius and what it represents, that hybrid technology, it is the most important development in the automotive industry in at least 20 years. But the Prius is not the car of the future. It is the stepping stone for all that will come in the automotive industry, however. Hybridization, which is what the Toyota Prius represents, is not the end game. If every single car were a Toyota Prius, let's say, if we were to just magically convert the entire U.S. fleet to hybrids, would that solve our energy issues? The answer is of course not, because we might get every car might be 20% more efficient or 30% more efficient, depending on how you drive. America's car fleet would still be 100% using oil, right, as the Toyota Prius does. So we wouldn't have actually solved the fundamental problems of geopolitics, of the potential for oil shocks. So that's why I say the Prius is an enabling technology for everything that will come later. Most cars and trucks will be hybridized in, say, 10, 15 years' time. As soon as companies can get their acts together and change over the machinery, we're going to move towards hybrids for almost everything, I believe. But I don't believe that the Prius is the end game. The real end game, and again, we can talk more about it if people like, but just in quick overview, I think we're moving towards a flex fuel or multi-fuel world in which gasoline will be one of those fuels in the tank, but you might only fill up your tank once a month or once in 6 months. The other fuel, and that might be ethanol, E85, that might be hydrogen, it might be electricity, depending on if plug-in hybrids or the related technologies take off. So you would have a hybrid technology to make the vehicle more efficient. I do think, in time, we're going to lightweight the car as well, so that you use much less energy of whatever source. It's a no-brainer. It's just a question of the car industry's stranded assets involved stamped steel and the old ways of doing business, what they know well. But there are a lot of disruptive innovators. Just look at the electric car made by Tesla Motors. The first successful new American car company really, in almost 100 years. And I've driven this car. This is extraordinary. I mean, the EV1, you folks will remember in the 1990s, GM had a pretty cool electric car, but, it could only go 80 miles, and you had to plug it into these paddles that weren't very commonplace. Well, the Tesla car, you can plug it in your house, at your dryer outlet, and it goes 250 miles between charges. The average American drives 25 miles. And not only that, this car can outrun a Ferrari. I know because the owner of the company, Elon Musk, he has a McLaren Formula One car, and I outraced his McLaren on the test track, 0 to 60 in less than 4 seconds. So this is a car that people will actually want. It's not a golf cart. And so technology is showing and shifting in ways that even Toyota may be disadvantaged in future. They may be number one in the conventional car business, but the real story about the auto industry is the changes that Toyota is helping bring about is actually opening up the world to disruptive innovators from the outside. As the car becomes more electronic, thanks to Toyota's advance, the proportion of the car that has advanced command and control software, the hybrid drives, and all of the related fuel management technologies you're going to need for flex fuel, suddenly you get a car that's 50% electronics. Is that really Detroit's core competence or Toyota City's core competence? That sounds to me like Silicon Valley, maybe Singapore. Maybe the cars of the future, we're talking 10, 20 years out, will be made by Sony and Intel with help from the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. The Magnas and so on, Lotus could design it. And so I think that's a real competitive threat for Detroit, the conventional automakers, who've anyway outsourced a lot of the car, the modules, the assemblies. We know this is not made by GM anymore. It's made by their suppliers. Well, that's a more flat organization. And that's something that outsiders have access to. So anyway, you asked me to talk about the business model. Those are a few thoughts on how I think the industry is going to evolve. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your speech. My question to you is to change the perspective. Can you comment on the fact that the hidden or the big, large elephant in our society or the world at large is coal? The fact that coal actually, the United States has about 26% of the coal reserves in the world, even though, and it's really a coal business, even though oil is very visible and very liquid, very transportable. Can you comment on coal being what it is from all the three
sure,
forces you have?
Happy to. You're quite right to point out coal is the problem today. I hope to persuade you that oil, gasoline, and cars will be the problem tomorrow. First to today's problem. I've already observed in my talk, China is putting up one giant coal plant a week on average. And this is expected to continue for the next 20 years. And why does this matter? It matters because the emissions from and these are pulverized coal plants using 1950s technologies, right? This is not the latest state of the art. They're not very efficient. China's coal plants, on average, are half as efficient as America's coal plants, which means they pollute all that much more. If this really continues as expected on business as usual, they're going to lock in an infrastructure that will be in place for 60 years. We know how long coal plants last. And that carbon shadow will be cast over much of the century, will make anything we do in America irrelevant in terms of carbon reductions, in terms of the Kyoto Treaty. That is the business as usual model, right? So you're right to point out coal. Not just China, India, South Africa. These countries have, South Africa is 90% plus coal. But the U.S. is also the Saudi Arabia of coal. We have hundreds of years' worth of reserves left. 55% of our electricity today comes from coal. Most of those coal plants are over 30 years old. They're all clunkers. We're just putting on duct tape and keeping them going. Fundamentally, this is an industry that has not historically been rewarded for capital stock turnover. If you look at any other innovative industry, whether it's biotech or pharma, or if you look at IT, remember that 0.5% figure that I talked about for R&D, which is very low. Historically, if you look at any other innovative industry, it's over 5%. Sometimes it's over 10% in terms of reinvesting revenues into R&D. Capital stock turnover is rewarded in the marketplace. Well, the way we regulate electricity is the reason we have coal the way we have it. As we move towards an era of carbon-constrained prices, and I do believe in less than 5 years, probably as little as 3 years, we are going to have a carbon price in America that is not zero. And through all of history, it has cost us nothing to emit carbon dioxide, to emit any greenhouse gases. That's not true anymore in Europe. It costs something, and it is fundamentally changing the European energy system away from coal. But I think the future is not only belong to windmills. And I want to be very clear. I've never met a windmill that could get my FedEx package from New York to Shanghai, right? There are limitations as to what you can do with alternative technologies, particularly with transportation. I think because there's so much coal in the world, China is going to burn it unless and until the rich countries of the world develop clean coal technologies, whether it's carbon capture and sequestration, IGCC, a number of good ideas on the table. A lot of these things, we know how they work. We've been doing carbon sequestration in the Permian Basin for 35 years. We know it works. GE developed IGCC technology, gasification and combustion technology, 25, 30 years ago. And so we know how it works. It's just very expensive to do, and there's no incentive to do it in the marketplace, right? My answer on coal is, I think it's pretty clear both the U.S. and the developing countries are going to burn that coal unless and until we buy down the cost of clean burning coal technologies. Ideally, it could even be coal to hydrogen, which could ultimately fuel a hydrogen economy, because you can get hydrogen from coal, sequester the CO2. So coal has to be part of the solution, and the way it'll work is we get the cost low enough that China and India will do it in the marketplace. They're not going to do expensive energy just because we care about climate change. Won't happen. And they're not going to put up only windmills because they want to make nice on the Kyoto Treaty. That's not going to happen either. So that has to be one of the pathways that the U.S. invests in, Europe invests in, and makes it happen. But why do I still say oil is a harder problem? Two reasons. First of all, if we wanted to get serious about the coal problem and global warming, the way that the U.S. got serious about acid rain under George Bush the father, we could put every coal-fired utility boss in a room. And again, if there were political will to do this, we could put a figurative gun to their heads, and say, look, you are going to accept. And this is what is happening in Congress now, right? The writing's on the wall. There will be mandatory CAFs. The utility business knows this. And they are now jockeying to get in on how to make the rules favorable to themselves, how to get in on some of the potential grandfathering, some of the lucrative tens of billions of dollars in grandfathering credits that they might get. Well, we know how to solve the coal problem because the political will is much easier to get a few potentially unpopular coal bosses in a room, tell them you have to do this, adopt this technology, or you have to put up with a carbon price. There's no way we're going to tell 300 million Americans they have to part with their cars. Never going to happen. And as long as we burn gasoline in an internal combustion engine, we will release carbon dioxide. There is no techno fix. There's no price of carbon that's going to solve that problem. If you burn gasoline, you are going to produce greenhouse gases. And even though coal has more greenhouse gas emitted than gasoline, than petroleum, conventional petroleum, let's not forget the sleeper, the iceberg below the surface that no one talks about. If you look at the oil in the world, it's true that it doesn't have as much greenhouse gas content as coal, which is more carbon. But what do we have in Alberta? We have tar sands. What do we have in the U.S. West? Shale. Venezuela, China. No one talks about this. China has vast quantities of what's called unconventional oil. This is mucky stuff. It's filthy to mine. It's environmentally unfriendly to produce, uses a lot of energy, a lot of water. And those of you that are familiar with tar sands, basically you crush 2,000 pounds of rock. It's like squeezing blood from a stone to get 1 barrel of oil. It takes a lot of refining. But ultimately, it produces gasoline that the consumer doesn't know any different from the gasoline you get from Saudi Arabia. Well, we're already doing this. Alberta's producing maybe 1 million, 1.5 million barrels a day already. So what does this mean? If we begin to tap that unconventional oil in a serious way, that's the real carbon nightmare, because the carbon content, the greenhouse gas content of unconventional oil is even bigger than the world's coal reserves. That's the path we're going on. And so that's why I worry more about the transport problem. Indeed, that's why I wrote this book on it, coming out shortly, because I think we can actually solve the coal problem. We have substitutes for coal, nuclear, wind, natural gas, and we have probably political will that we can't apply to cars. It's a much harder problem with oil. Another question.
Can you give us your take on bio-based fuels?
Sure. I think, of course, there's biodiesels and so on, but I think most interest is centered around ethanol, as people will know here. President Bush just met with President Lula of Brazil, and they've signed a treaty that President Lula says could save humanity. Like, well, don't hold your breath. The treaty is not actually very meaningful. But nevertheless, biofuels have a role to play. Biofuels will never replace oil. Let me write this down. You can come back to me in 50 years and we'll talk about it. But certainly, without astonishing breakthroughs in technology, I think what we're likely to see is biofuels play one role. It'll be part of a mix of things that will substitute for oil over time. In particular, I think most people will be aware corn ethanol is problematic. Corn, aside from the fact that there are subsidies involved in corn itself, and the mandates that are used to bring corn ethanol to market are also quite expensive. Basically, corn is not an energy-rich crop. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of fertilizer to actually make ethanol out of corn. The Brazilians in Sao Paulo State, they have a much better way to make ethanol. I've been down there, I've checked out the operations. I went in very skeptically, and I came back reasonably impressed. Because they take an agribusiness approach to producing sugarcane, reusing a lot of the waste bagasse and so on, they actually have an energy-efficient, environmentally benign way to do it, and it doesn't impinge on the Amazon, as some people claim. The sugarcane doesn't grow in the Amazon. There's no correlation between one and the other. There's not a trade-off with food. So I think actually sugarcane done on a proper industrial scale has the potential to be an important source of ethanol to the world. I don't think corn does. I think it's a diversion of our resources. I think we should stop, although politically it's very difficult. I think we should stop those subsidies and redirect them in other places, preferably not to corn ethanol. We should drop the tariff that keeps out the Brazilian stuff from coming into the U.S. Within 5 years, it might be 10 years, the real future for ethanol is the stuff that uses the biotechnology, cellulosic ethanol. President Bush has talked about this in his State of the Union speech. You folks will be quite aware. There's a lot of research being done, whether it's at the enzyme companies, the oil companies, the Monsantos, the Cargills, huge amount of investment. DuPonts are working on developing the right kind of enzyme technologies and right kind of biotech to make it work. I hope it does. I mean, that would be a transformative. So it would be 5 to 10 times more efficient than corn. It would really be, we could use agricultural waste, so there could be no trade-off with food. That would be a utopia. But even then, the best estimates I've seen suggest that, maybe we can replace 15% of world oil. We just use a lot of oil. The world is enormous, and its appetite is enormous. So I don't think we need a multiplicity of solutions. There's no single silver bullet that can help the world move beyond oil. Gentleman here.
I know it's an incredibly complex issue, but how do we make the transition from a regulated, cost-based electric market to one where there isn't an encouragement for innovation and competition without stumbling all over the transition? I know this is happening in the Michigan stage and on the national stage as well. Do you have any thoughts? Has anybody done it right?
Sure. No, it's a great question. I mean, we just need to look at California and the troubles they got into with their power crisis. I'm very careful not to use the word deregulation because that implies somehow there'll be no regulation. And this is part of the problem, that ideologues came along and thought that liberalizing energy markets means no regulation. And that's not the case. There will always be regulation in electricity. There always must be. There's no meaningful way to store electricity, as you all would know. This is not a commodity like bananas. You need it. You'll always have a grid operator. And until we have giant storage devices, which are some ways off, you need someone to be a manager of the grid system to make sure the lights stay on. And so we're not going to have a zero regulation system. It's not a commodity like some others. Having said that, if you look for positive models, I'll point to Britain, for example. Part of what we got wrong is, our federal structure actually worked against us when we talk about electricity reform. Doing it state by state was not the best way, and I've argued this is, federalism gone mad. There are some things where federalism is great. If you talk about reform of schools, or a local school district, or Wisconsin with welfare reform or health reforms, you can say, look, we can show in our state a different kind of approach to childhood health. You can show results. You can contain the experiment. Well, energy doesn't respect the boundary of a state line. Power grids are tightly integrated, and we have a national economy. So it doesn't make sense to have one state like California go off in a wacky, ultimately really bizarre situation where it had the worst aspects of regulation and the worst aspects of liberalization or deregulation kind of added on in a very acronistic and fashion, because that's who the lobbies were that were in the room. So when I said I'll point to a positive example, one of the things we didn't do right is transmission and distribution. The grid in America has been neglected, and it's showing. That's part of the reason we're having so many of these blackouts, is underinvestment. We haven't got the incentive structure right. We don't have full open access for a transmission of power. Well, if you take a look at Britain, the National Grid Company was a government-run operation. They privatized it because they wanted to make it more efficient. But they regulate it quite carefully. And the electricity regulator in Britain is quite robust. They keep but they do it in the way that even Adam Smith, the hero of capitalism, said, there is a proper role for the night watchman, the vigilant policeman. And that's the right role for the regulator. Not nosing around in your business telling you, put on this scrubber and do this and do that, and why did you do that? But watching for oligopolistic behavior, for market manipulations, and making sure that, if you're a grid operator who's supposed to give open access, you actually give open access. You don't give preferential access to your own sister company. Well, we don't do that in this country adequately. At the federal level, the FERC the Federal Energy Regulator let the country down in the case of California, in my opinion. That was under both President Clinton and President Bush. It was not a partisan thing. It was an ideological thing. And what I found in Britain was this privatized but carefully monitored grid operator, which had to give open access to all. They had quite foresighted regulation. They said, look, unlike in America, they said, we're going to give you incentive-based regulation. We're going to talk to you about what are the minimum needs for the grid system. You have to make investments, because now it's in your hands. It's a public good, but privately run, so you're going to be more efficient. We're going to watch. But if you make more investments that go beyond what we agree, we're going to give you a much higher rate of return. So what did you do? You created a virtuous cycle. And you had the company, the grid operator in Britain, make 10 times the investment in upgrading its grid during the 1990s than the entire U.S. system, once you adjust for the size of the grid. Proportionately speaking, Britain upgraded and modernized its grid to be a 21st century grid. Whereas in America, we know how it is. The last mile to your house is still a dumb grid. System operators often don't know what the heck's going on. Anyone who read we all remember the great blackout of 2003? Were you folks affected here by any chance? You weren't? Okay, very little. Well, 50 million North Americans lost power. I was one of them. I was sitting in Manhattan 25 hours without power. And, when I was astonished to hear First Energy didn't know what was happening on its own grid. You saw the transcripts in the papers. They were talking to the system operator saying, hey, what's going on? Are there some trees down? I mean, what is this? We're in the 21st century here. And they didn't know what's happening on their own system. Well, this is the lack of investment in our own grid infrastructure. With what's basically 1990s intelligence. We know how the internet works. We need to embed that intelligence into our grid, the smart grid. Well, Britain has done it. So 2 weeks after the American blackout, Britain had an equally catastrophic blackout. Shut down London. I was in the dark for 25 hours. Anyone want to guess how long my colleagues in London were in the dark for? Half an hour. They figured out the problem. They got it online. The smarts of the technology and the investment worked. So that's why I say, there are models that work. We need to, especially because of our federalist structure, we've gotten some things wrong. Any more questions? I see in the back there.
You seem to indicate that the peak oil philosophy is not right.
A little louder, please. I'm sorry.
You indicated that the peak oil theory is flawed. Would you explain that, please?
Sure, happy to. My view is not a popular one in the investment community because a lot of people are making the bet that oil prices can only go up, that there's a natural floor for oil prices. I take a very different view. I think that while there's lots of short-term reasons that markets are tight, the price, if Al-Qaeda attacks, and I'm very concerned about the potential for terrorist attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. Not in Ecuador, not in Venezuela, not in Nigeria, not all the stuff that makes the headlines, but there's certain parts of the energy infrastructure that are incredibly vulnerable. And we can talk about them later if anyone's interested, but what they are, why they're vulnerable. So prices could go even higher, but it's not because the resource base is small or dwindling. There are two things that are happening. The Western oil companies Exxon, BP, and so on, are having difficulty replacing the reserves that they pump. The reserve replacement rate, for example, they've run into trouble. Shell Oil famously lied about some of these issues because it was having difficulty replacing its reserves. There was a scandal a couple of years ago on how they booked reserves. Some people have misunderstood this to be an early warning sign that the world's running out of oil. There's plenty of oil, even conventional oil, left. BP and Shell can't get their hands on it. Why? It's in Saudi Arabia, it's in the Middle Eastern countries, and it's in Russia, even Venezuela, countries which have nationalized their oil industries and where they're booting out the foreign companies. If you know what's happened in Venezuela and Russia, they've effectively kicked out foreigners. And Putin has even torn up the contracts, effectively, that Shell in Sakhalin Island, I went out to Sakhalin Island, saw their wonderful project, they've invested $10 billion plus. And now basically they're being forced to give away that concession to Gazprom and Putin's cronies. People misunderstand the difficulties at Western oil majors to mean that the system is running out. It's not. It's in the hands of government companies. The Saudi oil company, Aramco, let's not forget, is 20 times the size of ExxonMobil when it comes to oil reserves. Exxon may be the biggest company on the Fortune 500, but the private companies of oil, meaning Exxon, BP, they hold barely 10% of global reserves. This is the only industry in the world that's topsy-turvy like this, where the most inefficient, corrupt, government-run companies are the ones that hold the best, lowest cost reserves. And so I think people misunderstand the nature of the business. The second reason, if you ever needed any one killer argument to someone who tells you we're going to run out of oil, just point to Alberta. And we already know we can make gasoline out of that stuff at great, environmental penalty, I'll admit to you, and more expense than Saudi oil, but we can do it. There's more energy in Alberta with zero exploration risk than in all of Saudi Arabia. And that's not controversial. That's widely accepted. There's more energy trapped in the tar sands of Alberta than all the oil in Saudi Arabia. So now you tell me, how are we hitting peak oil? People tend to not look at the unconventional oil, but I say, why wouldn't it come to market? You tell me why it won't come to market. That's actually what you should ask anyone who tells you we're running out of oil. Why wouldn't the U.S. shale, which Shell is now developing, why wouldn't Venezuela's really heavy reserves? Why wouldn't China's completely untapped heavy reserves? Why wouldn't they come to market since we know how to make them into gasoline? Now, the price might be higher, but that's okay. The argument wasn't about price. The argument was, are we running into peak oil? And I hope I persuaded you to at least think again on that. Another question? Any, sir?
One-word question. Anwar.
I have no problem with drilling in Anwar. I think that there's a reasonable debate we should have as a society as to the legitimate trade-off between environmental damage and additional resources. I have seen enough of how the ecological footprint, so to speak, of drilling has reduced from the 1970s to the 80s to the 90s to what we can do with multilateral and complicated drilling, 3D seismic technologies, to appreciate the industry's argument that this can be done in an environmentally sensitive way. There will be some inevitable spills, but I think that's a reasonable area for intelligent people to have a discussion. I don't think it should be an ideological ban saying this is untouchable. However, I do have a beef with those who argue that this is going to make a darn bit of difference to America's energy independence. And whenever anyone says energy independence, with respect to our congressmen, especially politicians when they use the word energy independence, please be suspicious. This country will never be energy independent until we get off of oil. Why? Because we have so little oil and we use so much. It's a simple fact. We consume a quarter of the world's energy every day. Almost 50% of the global gasoline every day is consumed here in the U.S. We have less than 3% of the world's proven reserves of oil. Less than 3%. The Saudis have 25%. The Middle East has almost 2/3. Right? We use so much and we consume so much and we have so little under our ground that it's meaningless to talk about energy independence. If we were to open up not only Anwar, but the Rockies and the stuff off Florida that Jeb Bush doesn't want to open up, all the protected lands in America to oil drilling, it wouldn't make a dollar difference in the world oil price, and it wouldn't make us any more energy secure. It's just not enough. Like I say, I'm not against it on ideological grounds, But let's be honest here. Let's look at the numbers. Let's look at the actual marketplace and have a reasonable debate. I'm open to that. Yes, sir.
The president of PG&E has stated just recently that the spinning reserves of electrical power plants in the United States, not used power, could supply between 150 to 180 million plug-in electric hybrids. Where is that going? When is the electrical utilities, as you stated before, when are they going to see this enormous business model to sell power? They have no market.
That's a great question, because I think one of the great trends that's going to happen over time, not tomorrow, not in 5 years, but I think the lines between the electricity industry and the car industry are going to blur. And these are two great icons of American greatness, right? Two great engineering accomplishments. But they've been fundamentally different. Why? Well, obviously, your car, which works great as a transportation device, is noisy and smelly, and you wouldn't want it running in your garage to run your house, right? Because it burns gasoline. Well, as we move towards electric drive, and increasingly the car is electronic, as within 3 years, as GM claims with its Chevy Volt, as Toyota claims with its plug-in Prius, as several other car makers may beat them to market, as electric cars come up, I think we're going to see the potential to plug in your car. And in particular, if you do it at night, which is when you would be encouraged to do it, when the rates would be the lowest, when the system is actually fallow. In the Pacific Northwest, they have so much hydro. They'll give away electricity at night, essentially, because their nuclear plants have to run all the time. Hydro is there for you all the time. Nighttime rates are so cheap. That's when those plug-in cars will come. What you're going to see is an integration over time of cars into the grid. Now, again, this is as visionary, or you might say utopian, as it was to talk in 1980 about, I see a world where everyone has something called the internet, and phones will be connected, and you can talk to everyone. You can walk without a cord. And people said, well, you're crazy. That'll never happen. Imagine someone saying that in 1980, and then by the year 2000, we had not only cell phones and the internet, but peer-to-peer networking, Napster, distributed computing, all the stuff that we have, right? That's what the arrival of the PC meant, and IBM didn't understand it. AT&T didn't understand what it meant. Well, that's how quickly the world changed. I predict, this will happen between the great industries of cars and electricity as well. So watch this space.
Thank you. I also want to please everyone join me in thanking our keynote speaker, Vijay Vaitheeswaran.
Thank you all very much.